Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the first of BioPharm CTMS webinars for 2012. Last year, we provided 9 free CTMS webinars on topics such as CTMS 101, Siebel clinical best practices post-implementation, and increasing your ROI through an effective CTMS training program, and many others. So all of those webinars from last year are available for download from our website at any time, www.biopharm.com. And this year, we're going to be providing at least 6 webinars on additional topics for CTMS, starting with today's webinar, the ins and outs of CTMS data migration. So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Param Singh, and I am the Vice President of the Clinical Trial Management Solution Practice at BioPharm Systems. I've been working in the industry since 1999 and have almost exclusively been working with Siebel Clinical during that time. Before joining BioPharm a little over 4 years ago, I was part of Accenture's pharma R&D practice and leading Siebel CTMS implementations there as well. Overall now, I've been part of more than, I think, 15 implementations of Siebel Clinical. And these vary from implementations for pharma, CROs, medical device companies, academic institutions, and they also range from anywhere from local implementations of 30 users to global implementations of over 4,500 users. And so each type of and size of organization has its own approach to implementing the solution, as well as all the considerations specifically around data migration, and we're going to cover some of those today. So now that I've introduced myself, I'd like to take a minute just to talk about my team here at BioPharm and explain a little bit about what we do. We provide a variety of services and products related to CTMS. We manage implementations of Siebel Clinical, whether those are custom implementations or implementations of our Siebel Clinical Accelerator, ASCEND. Also, if you've seen some of our previous webinars, you know that we do extensive work with integrations as well in Siebel Clinical and related systems. Our approach to system implementations is very process-driven, process-focused, and we also provide our process consulting services to help organizations define and harmonize their SOPs and business process across their organization with respect to clinical trial management. And we also offer comprehensive training services and products related to Siebel Clinical and our ASCEND solution as well. So this is just a glimpse of some of the services that we offer and products that we offer in the space. And for more information, feel free to contact me. So here's today's agenda. Following these introductions, we're going to get right down to business and discuss strategies for determining the answers to each of the questions. Should we migrate? If so, what exactly should we migrate? How should we do so, and when? And so by the end of the webinar, you'll have a framework for performing this sort of analysis for your own organization. And after we build that framework together, we'll be providing a live demonstration of 2 mechanisms that we've built for migration. One is a configuration of an import feature that we built in Siebel Clinical, utilizing some of the embedded tools, and then we've also built a separate migration tool called ASCEND-Migrate, which is one of the available methods for migrating your investigator database to Siebel Clinical, and we'll look at how we can extend that to migration of all the data into CTMS. And so, like I said, we're also going to be looking at an enhanced import functionality that we've configured in Siebel to import data into the system as an alternative means to migration as well, and the pros and cons both approaches. And before we do get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the platform that we're using right now. We do have everyone else on mute. So if you do have an issue, please use the chat feature and just bring that to our attention. Also, along the way, if you have any questions that you would like me to answer at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session, please submit them as we go into the chat feature as well. And those questions come directly to me, and so I can answer them at the end of the webinar. And I also want to remind everyone that we are recording this presentation as well, and we're going to post it on our website afterwards. Let's get started. So the first question that we need to address and consider is, should we even migrate? We need to look at the legacy data that we have and determine what are the benefits of bringing all this data into our new system. This may include current active studies as well as historical data of past studies in our legacy system. For historical data, one benefit is that by having this data in one central system, we can enable comprehensive reporting across all of this data. If all the data is in one place, we can generate reports, view metrics, make timely decisions based on our analysis of that data. We would be able to do this via a data warehouse also. So if our legacy systems already feed into a data warehouse solution, this benefit alone may not be enough to make the case for a data migration for your organization, because you're able to get a lot of that reporting out of the data warehouse solution. The second one is also listed here, is related, where we can have a complete picture of each study in one system to be able to perform the same type of analysis and understand how we're trending as an organization with regard to our process for clinical trial management. For current and active studies, the benefits include the ones that we just mentioned, as well as benefits that affect current operations. So migrating active studies enables your workforce to be able to work within one technical system and one set of business processes. So when we implement a new system, we usually implement some modified processes as well. And with migration of all of your current studies, we can ensure that everyone is working within the same process and there's less confusion and complexity having to have resources trained in two or more different systems. Also from an IT and support perspective, migration and decommissioning of legacy systems also reduces the overall cost and support and maintenance of these systems. So if we do not migrate, we will have our IT staff supporting multiple systems, which includes maintaining the hardware as well as support tickets from the users and things related to that. Long-term, maintaining both systems is a very costly approach, and migration can help decommission the legacy applications quicker and reduce that overall cost. So we know the potential benefits of data migration now, and for each organization, the value perceived on each of these benefits will need to be determined and weighed against the risks. So let's look at some potential risks to data migration. There may be some loss of functionality in the new system. Example, if you're implementing Siebel Clinical in a phased approach, you may not have all of your integrations in place right out of the gate, or specific enhancements in place to capture and track certain pieces of data. And if we can't find a place to migrate the data to, there may be some loss of data potentially as well. So this could be a loss of data in that scenario where there's no target to the source attributes, or the data is represented in a slightly different way. So we need to cleanse or translate that data during that migration process. With any data migration, timing is going to be key. So going live with a new system when the data is migrated, and when the data is available to the user in the new system are all things to consider in the rollout. And in certain situations, there may be some lag time. So for example, the system may be live, and we just migrated the study, but the study team has yet to be trained on the new system, so they don't have access to the new system, which will create some lag time. And during that period, they're not able to manage that data for that study in the old system either, because since the study has already been migrated, any changes they make to the data in the legacy system won't get reflected in the new system. This is something that the deployment team needs to consider to ensure minimal lag time for migrated data. Time overlap is related to that example as well. If the company allows users to be in the legacy or both systems post-migration, so there has to be a clear directive on how to use that migrated data and to minimize and mitigate these risks. So this next slide just shows that example, or a couple of examples of different types of organizations and the different factors they need to consider when taking on a data migration initiative. There's no secret formula to when you should migrate or when you shouldn't, but certain factors will weigh in more than others at various organizations. So with this example, we have a growing CRO who has large-scale studies planned or already started. They have limited resources to manage these studies and limited IT resources to manage the systems and tools. So, we don't know how many systems they have currently that they're trying to migrate from, potentially, but if the studies with the new client, which is a key client, haven't started yet, there may not be a need to migrate anything. So, just focus on launching the new CTMS in time to get the new large, plan studies on the new system, and just run out the existing studies in the legacy system. But on the other side, for the oncology company, they have already some long-term trials that they're managing, and there's a considerable amount of data in the legacy system, and these studies are long in duration. So that may make the case for them to migrate certain studies. But if they're thinking about doing this from just a reporting and metrics perspective, they also have recently implemented a data warehouse, so they could get their consolidated data across studies from both systems via the data warehouse. So the key takeaway here is, the decision's not always going to be black or white. There are going to be several factors that'll go into the decision, and some factors may be more important in one organization than another. So let's look at the next question, which is, what should I migrate? So the scoping should take place at two levels. One at the study level, so which studies should be migrated, or which studies are good candidates for migration, and from those studies, which data types or records should we migrate from those chosen studies. So first, we need to look at good candidates for migration from a study perspective. You'll need to take into account the benefits you specifically are looking for, as well as from the previous question. So everything needs to align to the answer to your first question, which is should we migrate, and what are the benefits we're looking for. So initially, you must look at historical studies first, and whether you want that data in the new system for reporting purposes, or whether the legacy data is already in or planned to be in the data warehouse. Next, you'll have to consider your CTMS go-live date and end date for current and planned studies. So if you've made a decision that historical data can stay in the legacy system, then short-term studies will typically fall into that bucket as well. Since there'll be little overlap if the studies end shortly after the new CTMS system goes live, the easiest thing to do is let those studies end in the legacy system as well. So that leaves our long-term studies, which in many cases would be a good candidate for migration. The other thing to consider, other than the effort to do the migration itself, is the inevitable data cleansing effort that needs to occur before the migration. So for data that doesn't map directly from the legacy to the new CTMS, your business teams will have to find a way to retain that data or migrate it somehow. Also for the data that doesn't meet your newly defined data standards for the new system, there will be a cleansing effort to translate legacy data into those new standards for the new system. A simple example of that is addresses. So when the new standard is simply that the street prefix is spelled out S-T-R-E-E-T instead of S-T period or R-D period for road. Simple things like that. If we're implementing new data standards in the new system, but the old system doesn't meet those, there will be a manual sort of cleansing process that needs to happen. So for current studies, considering the size and the amount of data that's already collected, the more data that is in the legacy system, the more data that will need to be cleaned and migrated. So we need to take that effort into account. This slide just illustrates the example that I mentioned on the previous slide. So taking a study-by-study approach, we look at studies that are ending soon and realize it would be more effort to migrate them rather than let them run out in the legacy system. On the other side, there are studies that are starting soon, but by the time that we go live with the new CTMS, these studies will have very little data captured. So it may be easier to just enter that data in the new system when we go live. So we won't need to necessarily automate that migration either. But for long-term studies, there is a considerable amount of data, and these studies will run for several months or up to a year post-go live of the new system. And we don't want to be in the old system for that long. So we're going to migrate these studies and to keep our desired legacy system cutoff date intact. So now we've narrowed the scope from a study perspective as to which studies to migrate. Now we must define the scope of data types or records within those studies that hold information that we want to migrate to the new system. For this, we need to determine what you have available to track in the new system. So what are our targets? There may be cases where you're tracking something in your legacy system which doesn't have a clear target in the new system. So we need to determine what data has a placeholder in the new system. So a point to consider here is, consider everything that potentially could be migrated. Once we've examined the target, we need to look at the source or sources as to what you're tracking in your legacy systems. And there may be reasons not to migrate, some data. So, those reasons could include that you're not tracking a certain data type, so there's nothing to migrate. The selected CTMS doesn't offer functionality to track that data type, so we may not be able to track, let's say, adverse events in the new system, but we did in our legacy, so there's no placeholder, and we've made a business decision to not track that data in the new system. Or you have several sources of where the data is coming from, and you're only looking to migrate your main legacy system, but you have some existing external tools where you're tracking correspondence for some reason, and you're happy with that tool, or clinical supplies, and you're happy with that tool, and you don't want to migrate that data from that source to the new system. So now that we've made a clear mapping of data types and have identified what actually can be migrated, we must determine the business need for that data in the new system. So we need to consider the data need for historical and active studies. So, extracting and reporting the data, if there's no need for correspondence, no reporting needs, or again, that example for, no need for adverse events in the new system, since the safety system is going to be the system of record. So we need to look at the business need for any of these data types in the new system and how that fits within the process that you've defined. So we've covered now, whether we should migrate, what specifically is the benefit to migrate, and now it's time to ask, how are we going to do this? So to answer this question, we must first look at how many sources of legacy data do we have. Number of unique sources can dramatically increase the effort for a migration. We can be dealing with multiple CTMS systems on an actual, relational database like Siebel Clinical and others, or we can be dealing with Excel spreadsheets or custom trackers, Word documents, document management systems, etc. So sometimes data migration is a two-step process where data from these tools like Excel spreadsheets and other trackers are entered in a true legacy CTMS system, and then from there we migrate all of the consolidated data into the new system. Migration from each of these individual spreadsheets and MS databases and even multiple custom CTMS systems in various formats can be very costly. So along with data cleansing process, we can employ a data consolidation effort which will combine the data into one legacy format from which we can then build out our automated migration routines. That way we're if we're validating this, or at least thoroughly testing it, we're validating one specific approach and source of the migration. But when we look at each of these sources, each of the sources will need to be analyzed for the most effective way to migrate. Additional considerations on how we should migrate include determining the volume of data that each record type that you're looking to migrate. If the volume across the system is quite low, you may consider a manual data entry into the new system rather than configuring a fully automated migration routine or program for that entity. Remember, most migrations are a one-time thing, so that one-time cost for, again, a one-time run of the program needs to be understood. So, are we realizing the benefit, of this one-time investment, and does the benefit, outweigh the cost? Additional considerations to be understood are also the level of transformation of that data during migration. What are the relationships of the entities in both systems? Are we looking at a one-to-one relationship, one-to-many, or many-to-many, and do they match in both systems? Or are you going to have to transform the data into these target relationships of entities, which can be pretty complex in nature depending on the scenario. You also have to review individual attributes and fields, obviously, and whether you have a good mapping between the two systems. But over and beyond that, the data standards, again, are they in line between both systems, or do we need to cleanse or translate that data prior to migration? Again, a good example is that address example. These are free text fields usually, and if you want to adhere to a standard in the new system, you're going to have to cleanse that data in the legacy in your source as well, or translate it as it's being migrated. Another example is any fields that have lists of values. So if we're talking about like statuses, subject statuses, or types of visits, etc., are they named the same in both systems, or is there going to be a translation or a transformation from one value to another value in the new system? So list of values is another area that data standards come into play. The next area to consider are the tools and methods that are available for data migrations. We always have the option for manual migration, which is simply data entry, but where we recognize the need for the data from our legacy system, but we don't code anything automatic to migrate that data, but rather hire potentially temporary data entry folks to key in that data before go live. And in some cases, this may end up being a less costly method to migrate, depending on the volume of data in your legacy system. We actually had an organization, a very large organization, hire temp data entry personnel to key in several thousand contacts into their new system, instead of building a series of migration routines that would pull their contacts from various sources. And they actually ended up saving money just by doing simple exports into Excel or some format and giving that to data entry personnel to enter in their new system. So they ended up saving money by doing sort of a manual data entry rather than building out a validated data migration routine that, again, they understood that they would be only using one time. So obviously there's some risks associated with the manual entry of data as well, but they chose to go that route because it was, again, cost effective in their case. When looking at automated options, you have to consider embedded tools in your system that enable migration, such as Enterprise Integration Manager, or EIM, for Siebel applications. You may also consider the existing tools that your organization already owns licenses to, such as Informatica and other ETL tools available on the market. Your organization might already be using those, so you might utilize those for data migration. Or you may need to build out custom migration routines to transform the data appropriately. Of course, when selecting a tool, you'll need to consider various constraints such as budget, time, complexity, and available resources. Timing is a very important aspect of migrations. There are, of course, multiple options on when you can migrate your studies from your legacy system to your new system, but these need to be in line with other key decisions, such as your training approach for the new system and legacy decommissioning strategy. So each of these things need to be in line with each other when making this determination. Big bang migrations are when you decide to move all your studies that you've selected for migration at the same time, and you push a button and migrate them over all together. This would make sense if the users of the system are also getting trained in a big bang deployment. So if your entire clinical operations group is getting trained in the same week, and then they're going to be live in the new system, and there's a directive to do that, then that big bang migration makes sense. But if you're doing a piloted rollout of users, so you're training a small study team first, and you're doing a pilot study, then you would only want to migrate, again, those studies based on the study teams and users that have been trained on the new system. So if there's a specific study team and a handful of studies, then those are the only ones that you would migrate. There's no sense in migrating if the specific users that are going to be managing those studies are not trained and therefore not going to be in the new system to manage their data. You don't want that situation where data is just migrated and then sitting there. Where we've seen sort of great success, especially in larger organizations, is a phased study-by-study joint training and migration rollout. This allows the organizations to work out any minor issues in process, and also increases user adoption as well overall. This is, in some cases, easier to manage as well, since you're also training and rolling out smaller groups at a time. But I'll caveat that with, if IT can't temporarily support both the legacy systems as well as the new CTMS together, then Big Bang obviously would make sense. But like I said, everything needs to be aligned accordingly in that type of deployment, and it does introduce its own level of risk. So in summary, we've discussed the 4 phases, I guess, of CTMS data migration analysis. So we really have covered all the steps each organization needs to take before undertaking a migration initiative. This needs to be very thorough, from a planning and analysis perspective to any data migration initiative before understanding the full scope of the entire initiative. So, we'll summarize these. So the purpose, what is the business driver behind the migration? So the key takeaway here is, defining the business benefits early on, as this is going to be the driver to define the rest of the migration initiative. So with each of the subsequent phases, we're always looking back to, what was that business driver? What were the key business benefits that we were looking for? And that'll, drive the decisions that you make in, the subsequent areas. Scope, what studies we're migrating, what data we're migrating, and how that data is going to be used. Again, the key takeaway here is, definitely take strong consideration on the data that you need to migrate and how that aligns to, again, the overall business benefit that you've defined. Methods, what tools and resources are available, how do they fit with our budget and timeline. Really, need to take stock to the tools and resources, both technical and human resources that are available to you. Don't rule out a manual migration, since again, the cost of an automated migration is a one-time cost, and there's not too much reuse of the technical solutions that are going to be built from a migration perspective. Timing, what makes the most sense considering our CTMS rollout plan. Consider the rollout strategy, the training approach, when determining migration strategy. And all of these need to align with each other. We can't decide one strategy without impacting the other. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we are supposed to move into our live demo. But if there's any specific questions on just migration itself, we can address those at this time. So I'm looking through the questions. We have a question here on how to handle study by study when a user can work on multiple trials, and it's all around the world. So this is definitely a key consideration. So even when we're doing a study by study type of piloted approach, we have our operations groups and various resources working on multiple trials. So there will be a scenario in a piloted or phased approach where you have resources working in both systems. So they'll have access to both systems, but what's so there's a risk there because they need to be trained on two systems. They need to be trained on potentially two different processes of operations. But the key thing I would say is when you do migrate a study to be done in the new system, that that study becomes unavailable to those users in the legacy system. So they're going to be in the legacy system for the studies that haven't been migrated, but the ones that have been migrated, we're actually sort of forcing them, I guess, to use the new system. So you can phase them in that way. So in a phased approach, you're almost certainly going to have situations where resources are working in both systems, and that does produce its own risk, but you can reduce the risks, at least to the studies that you've migrated, that data is being maintained and managed solely in the new system. Another question we have is how do we handle monitoring reports stored in CTMS? So there's a couple different ways. So if in fact there are situations where a CTMS may be in place and you generate your monitoring reports from there, but eventually those monitoring reports make it into your document management system. So anything that is signed, approved, and completed, you can, it's in your document management system or a network share for that matter. When you're migrating, you can actually point the new system's document records or monitoring report records to include a link to that document in your document management system so that the data is complete. If in fact you have monitoring reports stored in the CTMS, in the legacy CTMS, and you need to do a migration effort, it'll have to be a sort of a customer routine to enable that. But one thing to consider is the implementation of an integrated document management system with the new CTMS as well, and accomplishing that sort of link again. So even if you have, your stored and completed monitoring reports are in one location in a document management system, and what we're storing in the CTMS is basically a link to that, and that goes with goes for the other documents that you track potentially in your CTMS as well, like all of your regulatory documents and protocol signature pages, etc. There's capability to employ a document management system, and then that way, when and if you do have multiple CTMS systems or you move from one to another, the only thing that you'll have to distribute is just that link to where those documents are stored, and that remains a constant. How does the migration handle version control? And I assume that is a question related to documents again. And I think that if we're storing documents within CTMS, so for example, Siebel Clinical does have the capability of storing attachments, but it doesn't necessarily have the capability of handling sort of robust version control, which is why we recommend anytime we're talking about attachments and documents, we rely on sort of robust functionality from a true document management system. So that again, if we just store the link or the reference to that document in the document management system, we let the document management system handle all of the key aspects of version control, check in, check out, all of those things remain intact, and the link typically points you to the latest version of the document anyway. So it becomes a lot easier, managing documents and attachments if you're actually using a an integrated document management system with your CTMS. And incidentally, we do have a prior webinar that we did last year related just to that topic. So there's a full webinar on integrating your CTMS with a document management solution, and that could tie in with this again the data migration conversation as well. If you have these documents stored in your CTMS and you're migrating, that becomes a whole lot more complex than having that integration link between the document management system and your CTMS, because that again is just a data point that we're migrating versus migrating the entire stack of documents that are attached to your system. So right now, what I'll do is we'll switch gears and we'll do the demonstration. And after the demonstration, we'll come back to any additional questions that you may have as well. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover two different methods that we've configured for migration. One is utilizing the Siebel import functionality, which is inherent functionality in Siebel, but we've configured it specifically for our purposes around contacts, accounts, and addresses, and made some configurations in terms of mapping. So we're going to look at that first. Here. We have two systems open because we're going to look at two different ways. Again, first the import, and then the second is the ASCEND-Migrate tool. So for this example, we're going to go into our contacts list, and there's a menu option of import. So that's what we're actually utilizing. This is a typical inherent functionality of Siebel, but you need to configure it for any and every entity that you're going to. Sorry about this. Any and every entity that you want to be able to migrate into your system or import into your system. So that's what we're going to utilize, but I'm going to show you our files first. So the files actually need to be in a certain format, a certain template. So we're going to look at our contacts. So it's simply a CSV file that is formatted in a certain way with a listing of the fields in the order that we've configured the application to accept. So in this situation, we're pulling in these contacts, Robin John, Vincent John, and Navir John, and we can also import addresses as well. So these addresses don't exist in the system, and they'll automatically get pulled in during that import and assigned directly to this specific contact. So for those of you that are familiar with Siebel, you know that contact is one entity and address is another. So in this format, we're actually loading two separate entities and we're making the relationship between the two. And if, for example, if Rob and John had 6 different addresses that we wanted to import, we would have 6 different denormalized records that have Rob and John's information here, and then a different address for each of those 6 rows of data related to Rob and John. So when we need to import multiple records or multiple relationships, we're able to do that in the import feature, but only for the specifics of related entities. So for this one, very simply, I'm going to let me query the system and look for Johns. There's no Johns in the system. So we're going to cancel that query just to make sure that there's no Johns. And now we're going to import. So I select my import, And when I do this, I can select my file, which is our contact. And you'll notice that it's a concept verted file, so we don't change anything there. Import source, you can do an auto mapping, which the system tries to determine what the mapping should be. But a predefined mapping is what we did. So we configured a BioPharm mapping, which is specifically the format that we want, the fields that we want to be able to import. And we're going to overwrite any existing records in the system. So when you select this option, as long as the user keys match, let's say his email changed or his work phone changed, you can actually import that, and that will be reflected without creating a new record for Rob and John and creating any duplicates. So here I'm going to select Next, and here you can see the mapping that's already laid out for the BioPharm mapping. You could update the mapping with the available fields here, but we've already created and configured this mapping already, so it's good to go. We're going to click Next, and it tells me that the import is completed, total number of records that are imported. You can also view a log. You can see if there was any failures, like if you were missing required fields, or some of the drop-downs weren't available, or you had the wrong field or wrong value in a drop-down field. It will give you those errors. So now if we query for John, last name John, we have Robin, Vera, and Vincent, and there's our information that was coming directly from our spreadsheet, including the addresses as well. So very simply, you're able to do this import. You can configure it across the board. Out of the box, it's not really configured to do it with anything other than context. But even that, the mapping that is configured is not necessarily ideal. So you would have to configure across the board if you want to be able to give your users or give administrators the ability to import from Excel or CSV. So this is one mechanism or one way of enabling this. And the great thing about this is it's reusable, right? So this became particularly important for a CRO customer of ours that gets lists of contacts to use from their sponsors. So they just put that list in the prescribed format, and they can import directly from the user interface like that. And the great thing about it is it takes into account all of the rules and all of the sort of business rules that are in place when you're adding a contact, like all the list of values or the job titles, state codes, etc. Anything that has a finite list of values, incorporates that into it, incorporates that validation into it. But the one sort of drawback to obviously this import feature is you're only able to do it for whatever you see on the screen. So I can only load contacts at a time. If I need to load accounts, I need to go to accounts and load a separate account listing here. So it is a one-off sort of import, and you're actually using the application to do it. So it's not something that's running in the background. You have to have the system open to be able to do that. But the second mechanism is our ASCEND-Migrate tool. And for this, we sort of used a similar approach because we still wanted to utilize the sort of the front-end rules that we've configured in the application. So we used Siebel objects that understand that and recognize the objects from a business layer perspective. We're not loading them directly to the database. So we built out a external tool that enables us to do something very similar in nature, where we're loading contacts, accounts, or addresses. Right now we're only focused on the investigator database with the ASCEND-Migrate tool. And I'm going to load it just to show you what it looks like, and we're going to utilize it. Before that, let's look at the object set that we have created. So this allows us to load multiple environments when we're, again, the tool itself is sitting outside of the environment, right? So we can actually select which environment we're going to by utilizing this ini file. So if I open up this configuration file, simply it just tells the tool which environment we're loading, what's the server names, the enterprise server object manager, the environment sort of parameters of which Siebel environment are we loading. So this enables you to load your development environment, your testing environment, your training environment, and it's all happening outside of Siebel itself. So it can be running in the background, while your user's in the system. You don't have to be logged into the system to be able to do that. Whereas, it doesn't impact any sort of performance as well, since we're sitting outside. So let's look at this example. We're going to go into a different environment. But the examples are, I believe we've set up the very similar examples here. So we have, same thing, last name John. We have a bunch of contacts here. We have their work phone, work fax, all the attributes. We have also addresses as well. And we do have a status column which shows you after the import whether what was successful and what was not. So there's error handling directly in the data sheet itself. So I'm just going to delete that and save it. Make sure that's saved. Okay. So now we'll go into our tool. Actually, let's go into the system first. So now I'm going into a different system, a different environment, actually. Okay. So I'm going to go into our contacts again, into our contact list, do a quick query, locate any Johns. Okay, so we don't have any Johns in the system. And now I'm going to go into our ASCEND-Migrate tool. So here's where, So here's where we're going to go and load our configuration file. So this is what telling the tool which environment we're loading. We're going to select our object. We're loading contacts. We're browsing for our contact Excel file. And we're going to provide our username and password. So it's actually going to log into the system sort of remotely. So this is running in the background, and it's going to load everything into Siebel. So I'm going to click that, and it's going to do its processing. One thing I'll mention here is that right now the ASCEND-Migrate tool is again focused on the investigator database. So it's loading contacts, accounts, and addresses for the most part. But this can be extended. So right now it's doing the same thing as, or similar things as what we experienced in the import feature. But you can extend this tool so you're actually able to load all of your objects together. So instead of utilizing an Excel sheet that only has one worksheet in it, you can load an Excel file that has multiple tabs, where you're starting from your program, your protocol, any sort of protocol attributes, then your site management and subjects, activities, etc. So you can actually develop a workbook that has all of the Siebel objects, and we can enhance the migration tool. So it basically takes that entire workbook and imports the entire study into Siebel. So there's capability to extend and enhance this tool, so it's not just looking at one object at a time. So that's the benefit of using sort of a tool like this, because you can customize it, you can make it a little bit more flexible in nature, and that way you're not having to again be in the system and run imports on each of the different pieces of hierarchy. You can actually use this tool and enhance it, so your Excel sheet actually contains all of your data, or all of your data for one particular study, and it processes it all again in the background, right? So it's running. You can kick it off, at any point, and it's just running in the background. So if we go back into our Siebel application and now query, now that has run, this shows us those those records that were coming from the system, and it's loaded those records. Now you'll notice that the first record actually loaded the address, but the subsequent records don't show an address, but it loaded the contact itself. So since they're two separate entities, it loads the contact, and if it has an issue with the address, you'll see it in the in the file itself. So if I open up the contact file that we just loaded, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag. So it actually shows you the success, the status of each of those imports. So if there's a fully successful file, we know that the address and the contact made it. If there were required fields that are not populated in the address, for example, or this invalid LOV, the contact itself made it in, but the address didn't. So we can see what's happening with each of those imports, just by looking in the Excel file that we loaded. So that's one sort of advantage to that as well. So with that, I'll open it up for questions as well. Let me go back to, there we go. Okay, so with that, I'll open it up for additional questions. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to submit it on the chat feature. And since we are sort of out of time, I guess, if you do have any questions specifically about this, or other sort of integration or migration questions, you can send them my way, and I'll put it on the screen with where my email is listed, and then we'll see if we can address those questions via email. But I do want that, so that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. Thanks for sharing the past hour or so with me. I hope you found the information useful. Next month, I do want to mention that we'll be presenting at the CBI CTMS conference in Philadelphia. Our workshop this year is about managing clinical trial information with with smaller organizations. We hope to see you there. It's on March 22nd and 23rd in Philadelphia. And our next webinar is going to be on April 26th. It's going to be specific to Siebel Clinical. We'll be explaining how to tailor your Siebel Clinical user interface to make it highly relevant for your particular job or what you want to be able to see, so you can actually tailor the user interface to per user. So you can sign up for that and any other future webinars via our website under News and Resources link on our main website, www.biopharm.com. And as a reminder, today's presentation is going to be available for download from our website within 24 hours, so look for that. And you can share that link out to those that weren't able to join the webinar today. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to contact me directly. My email address is on the screen. And again, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye.